We're at 9:02, and I guess we'll wait one more minute. Looks like we have a nice crew already. Let me see if I can put up my slides here. Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yep.
I think we can get started. So I like to always start the meeting with a few common slides. And I would just want to remind ourselves of what the objectives are for this particular spec, the next version. I think the first one is really important because it scares some that are already conforming, right? We don't expect the 3.0 to be a huge difference or a huge change over 2.1, although maybe calling it 3.0 might be a little misrepresentative of that, and we should probably maybe call it 2.5 or something. So we really haven't determined the actual version number. What I'm curious to understand is that we're in the process of being adopted by the ISO organization as an ISO spec, and they may have some guidelines on how you do updates to existing versions of the spec. But I think I want to, let people know that we're not looking at a radical upgrade. We are looking to incorporate feedback from people who are already conforming. We're also looking for feedback from organizations who are struggling to conform to find out why it might be difficult. We also want to make sure that we continuously maintain what we call the minimum set of requirements that all quality compliance programs should adhere to. So if people are coming up and recognizing some additional process or task they believe that all compliance programs should adhere to, we should seriously consider adding that. We're hoping that at this point that we have pretty much what we consider to be the minimum set. We don't want to become this grand superset. We want to be the most basic set and give people a lot of freedom or flexibility to implement their program the way they see fit. And then one of the things I think we might get into today is this idea of exploring this option of possibly adding a module to the spec, not a required module, but an optional module around security vulnerabilities. And the reason why I highlight this has been brought up is because it's a natural extension of what we do. So the compliance we're focused on here is license compliance, right? And really the ultimate objective of the spec initiative is to build trust around the use of open source. And you got to start with licensing. If you don't have the license, you can't use it, right? But also a natural place for trust is around security vulnerabilities. In fact, as I go forward, working with our customers and they audit us from time to time, I'm finding more and more questions around security vulnerabilities around open source being asked of the same team that's actually managing all the open source with respect to license compliance. But again, we can get into that. Okay. I always like to remind people that we have a number of resources. There's a wiki that has some basic information of how this process works, different versions of the spec and so forth, and in particular the FAQ, which is the second bullet point here. And I'd like to request all contributors who participate to read the FAQ, because it does address a number of questions that I think are relevant to anybody who's contributing. Then there's the current spec, which is we call 2.1 RC4. We're looking to finalize that once we get the ISO acceptance and whether they come back with any requirements. And finally, issues around the spec. People can submit issues or concerns. But before I go any further, in addition to posting those issues or concerns on our issues list, I would like to start the meeting off with asking those who are coming here, if you haven't already posted an item on that list, if you have additional feedback ideas that you'd like to see considered in this round of the revision of the spec, particularly with respect to someone's reading of it, someone's experience attempting to conform, and also maintaining conformance. So let me pause really briefly. If you haven't put a comment on our issues list, are there any other some concerns that you're seeing that you like just offer?
So Mark, it's Sammy. If I may, it's interesting. As you know, as ARM, we're actually conformant with 1.2, and we are currently reviewing the 2.0 to get our conformance for 2.0. And I have to be honest, I have not had a look at the FAQ, but one of the things that we had today was around sort of not clause 6, but part 6 of the current spec, where sort of the declaration of either whole organization or a program within the organization. And I was just trying to figure out where would that declaration be? Is it something that you would expect to see in the conforming organization's website, for example? Also, there was in that same section, there is the 18 months expiry, and I don't know whether that's automatically going to be triggered by the certification process, that people will get reminders. And as I said, I have not had a chance. It was just a meeting I had this afternoon where we're reviewing, so I didn't really get a chance to check what is the real meaning of this, and how do you double check. So it's section 6. So if you go to
can you see my screen? Is it showing?
It's 3.6, but is that,
can you see 3.6? Oh,
yeah,
is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, of course I was looking at 2.0 rather than the. So yes, you're right. It is the right section.
Okay. Definitely, we can address that today while you're here, and we'll pick that up as our first issue to discuss. Any other
And
thoughts?
sorry, as I said, it's both of them. It is that sort of 361 and 362, which is the 18 months
Right.
duration. How that reminder is the organization itself expected to revalidate, or are we likely to receive a reminder from the certification team to sort of say you need to renew your certificate?
Okay, great. I think that's a helpful discussion to have. Okay, before we go any further, any other comments or thoughts that people like us to consider, in addition to what Sammy just mentioned and what's already on the issue list?
Hi, this is Julian. I'm currently in the process of moving some of the feedback that we internally have to GitHub. And one of the things I wasn't able to move was a certain issue with the quality of how OpenChain should be implemented. As you see from an auditing perspective, we have to or try to put some high standards onto the auditing of OpenChain, but for some points, we currently fail to see the exact on the necessary requirement. We see the requirement that we project onto it and that we try to assess. But sometimes, for instance, the bill of materials doesn't, it isn't completely clear how we are supposed to assess the quality of the bill of material generation. Well, and again, while we try to do this internally, while we have our idea of how this looks, I wonder if this would be a point that could be addressed in this spec without bloating it. And this is, as you see, the reason why I wasn't able to move this to the issues yet, because this is more a thought than a suggestion.
Okay, I think it's worth a discussion among the group, And we should have that as well while you're here. Now, there are other issues on the list that we're going to get to as well, but when people bring up items during this meeting, I prefer to have those discussions while they're here. So, and then when we run out of those items, we'll go back to the issue list. Okay, so we can definitely address that next as well. Great point. Anybody else?
Sure, Mark. This is Mary Matron. My company is just getting started looking at the standard and figuring out how if we want to implement it, and if so, how. So I don't have any comments at this point. We haven't raised any issues. And so I would like to take a rain check on this item.
And I think that's great. We'd love to have the new eyeballs, the fresh look at the spec and tell us your experience along the way. Even if you share your experience and things are okay, that'd be great to hear here as well. Or a part of that experience might be, well, this is a little difficult to understand, or this is a little difficult to implement for our company, given our dynamic, the way we're organized. We'd love to hear that too. So thank you for raising that potential future feedback. I'm really looking forward to that.
Okay.
So Mark, if I may add just to Mary's point, Mary, you might want to look at, there has been a number of case studies over a long period of time in the last sort of 2-3 years where companies shared some of the issues that they have faced. So, and these are all available. A lot of the recordings and publications are available on GitHub. So you could definitely benefit from looking at those rather than try and reinvent the wheel. Just it's useful to see how other companies approach certain things.
Yeah, we've had an active compliance program, open source compliance program for many years. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Walt Miner, who's works for the Linux Foundation now, but he used to work for my company. And for a company I used to work for, Motorola, back in the day. And he was very active in starting up that open source compliance program. So I think for us, we will certainly look at case studies and see if there's things we can learn. But it's going to be around more like what we have now, and does this work, or what would we have to enhance of our existing program to meet the standard?
Yeah, and again, some of those case studies go into a bit more detail. I know I spoke about some of the challenges that we at ARM, we've had a compliance program for many years, but just some of the challenges to map what we're doing with OpenChain, and some of the adjustments that we had to make, and I have to say none of it was major. It's just really just things like making sure that things are documented and accessible, etc. So training, as many of you know, has been a big challenge, documenting who has been trained across our organization. That was a key challenge for us.
Yeah, and I think what you're going to find, Mary, is that our goal is to make sure that there are many ways of implementing a program, right? That people have their way of doing it, and that the spec is here to make sure some basic core things are in place, but there's still flexibility around how to implement that one piece. And I think the three comments that came forward just now really remind me of what we're trying to do is have people talk about, to Sammy's point, their common practices or best practices on implementing these. And sometimes that will work for one organization, not another, obviously. And I have a feeling if you have a very sophisticated program in place, our hope is that you could retrofit it. We're not too much of an effort, but then you might want to get some clarity. I think what Sammy's asking for is clarity on how one might implement a requirement, some understanding. It's a practice, and we could talk about someone and how they implemented that practice. So great. I'm looking forward to your feedback. Okay, anybody else? Okay, so let me go back. I was going to jump in some issues that we have on the issue list, and we'll get there. But I do want to touch on the ones that were just brought up now because they're fresh. So coming back to Sammy's initial point he was, we can start there. And what we have is, this is a requirement that says, we want you basically to sign off, right? That you've satisfied all the requirements of the program. And I guess, Sam, you're asking how that might be accomplished. Like one way of implementing that. Is that your request here?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, you do have the self-certification app that is managed by the project, and in my mind, it wasn't clear whether. Because obviously, whether that satisfies this obligation or whether we have to go and do something over and above. I have some ideas what we can do, but really just wanted to understand from a practical aspect how that can be accomplished.
And then we'll go right into the 3.62 after that, which is related. Okay, so before I make any comments, does anybody else have any thoughts about that? Maybe someone who's implemented a program.
Mark, it's Andrew here. So the way that we have anticipated this might happen, and it's in the template open source policy that we've developed, is basically just by putting some wording that people put into a document that basically says, we certify that we comply with all the requirements of OpenChain Specification, whatever, version 2.1, in respect of the following project, dated so and so, and then that's just a document that has to be made publicly available somewhere. And then if it's an external verification that's being done by somebody, then the external verifier can add their they can basically countersign that and say that they agree that conformance has been reached. So my view is it's a fairly simple document that states that it's either self-certification or external certification, what the scope is, what the version is, what the date is, and then that is made publicly available somewhere, so you can actually see it on the website, download it, whatever.
Yeah. So I think that's a fine way of doing it. I don't think you have to make it public, though. I think that's an important distinction. So I think we do something similar, meaning we'll go ahead and make a document, a simple statement, and put the date down, the version, and then in some ways that allows us to address the 6.2, right? The 3.6.2, which then you have the trying to show that you have this 18 months within the last 18 months, you've verified that you're still good. So one possibility, and this is only a possibility, this is one way of doing it, and by the way, you can make it public if you choose. There's nothing that would stop us, stop you from doing that, but I don't think it's a requirement. One possibility is you go through and for each of the requirements in the spec is to gather up the evidence or references to the evidence, right? And put it in a single place. Every time we do a conformance to a certain version of the spec, we create a directory, right? And we create either a little notebook which documents the process or literally has some of the links to the documents that we're supposed to have, like having documented a certain process in place. And one of the documents we're going to have in that directory would be, similar to what Andrew said, it's a signed document, or it's basically essentially serves as a affirmation or a document that states that we're conforming with this version of the spec and it's this date in which we are conforming on. Now, that's just one way of doing it. There might be other ways.
Yeah, Mark, just on this public point, so I absolutely agree that it doesn't have to be made public. But I think that if somebody is going to claim that they have an OpenChain conformant program, then they have to make the document public, because otherwise there's, there has to be a definitive document that says what the scope is, because we don't want people using the imprimatur of saying, we're OpenChain compliant, when it actually turns out that it's just a tiny little bit of their organization that has been through the program. So I suppose from that perspective, all that I'm saying is that if they do choose to say in public that they've got an OpenChain conformant program or that their organization is OpenChain conformant, then that's the point at which they have to release the document and none of the other supporting materials. I mean, only that single document itself.
Well, I don't believe it's a requirement at this time to make it public. However, I'll tell you our experience with this in that we've had throughout the year, I would say we have several major customers come to us and they audit us on our software development lifecycle. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's not usually just the open source compliance stuff, but inevitably there's going to be a question in that audit that says, how do you handle open source? It's very often a very open-ended question. And I always come out with the spec, and then we go through and we sit down with them. And so they'll go meet the different groups within our software development lifecycle process, right? And everybody will talk about the different requirements they have in their audit. And when I get to the open source stuff, I simply say, well, I sit down and I pull out my directory, and I pull out all the artifacts. I pull out the spec. I say, this is what we conform to. It actually helps focus the discussion. And if they want to talk about 6.1, I'll show them the statement that we made. So I think it's anybody who is subject to an audit or is willing, will allow a third party to audit them, should have that document in place and should be expected to be asked, not just maybe the document or that piece of evidence, right? So I think that's a very valid thing someone should expect when they're auditing someone who claims publicly that they're open chain conforming. Any thoughts about that?
So, Mark, it's interesting. I have to say my initial interpretation was actually to make it public, and we did, because we have an external facing open source policy, and that actually, if you're trying to find it on our website to display it, we do say that we're conformant with 1.2. What we don't make in terms of a distinction, we talk about ARM being conformant to 1.2, and one of the initial thoughts from my perspective was actually just to expand that statement to state ARM as an organization. We are open chain conformant with 2.0. Which is to Andrew's point, achieves that, and again was going to put the date on which the conformance was accomplished. So yes, it would be publicly facing rather than.
Yeah, and I think that's great, and I think that you could use that web page as your document, right, as a satisfaction of this requirement. Right, that would be the document affirming. But at this point, I don't think it's not a requirement to make it public. Maybe we should talk about that. Maybe it should, but it currently isn't. And I think what you're doing it's perfectly fine, and I think it would serve as that document.
Again, so it's so we have an external page where we put a few other items like the GPL cooperation commitment, etc. So that's where we were going to, and also if you recall, there is a requirement to make make it possible for people to raise queries and questions around open source compliance, and again we put all of that in the same place.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to say again, it's I haven't had a look at the spec for a while, and it just so happened that we were reviewing the second half of the spec today to achieve the check the conformance requirements, going through the items one by one to validate and verify that yes, we've accomplished these steps. And that was the last item. That obviously that's a change from the 1.2, which is why I sort of slightly stumbled across it and didn't have a chance to look at what else other people may have done and how they may have done it yet.
Sure. And I think just by putting out the logo and making the claim that you're open chain conforming to a certain version, it's assumed that you have this document internally. In other words, you should have it. And upon audit, you have to present it. I would expect. Okay. So, any other thoughts about this before? I mean, we're going to move on to a very similar point. I think, Sammy, it just builds on top of what you're raising in the first one in the 3.6.1. Any other questions or thoughts about that before we move on to the 6.2?
I would, Andrew here again. I mean, I would say I think I favour the idea that if you are going to state publicly that you're open chain conformant or have an open chain conformant program, that should lead to an obligation to at least reveal details of what that means, and that's consistent with a number of sort of similar programs, like I said, 27,001. Because as I say, the concern is that we don't want people eroding the value of OpenChain by using it purely as some sort of marketing tag, when the reality is it only covers a small part of their organization. I think it goes hand in hand with saying that you're OpenChain conformant, is that you're saying, and this is the scope of our conformance. So I would favor considering that for the next revision is making that a requirement.
Well, I think that's a valid point. I mean, you're asking that we should consider adding that additional requirement, but making it public is what you're asking.
Yes. But only if you're saying that your OpenChain conformance is public as well. If you want to keep the whole thing internal and only release that information, to potential customers, for example, that's absolutely fine on the one-on-one basis. But if it's something that you have as your general marketing, then I think at the same time you should release what the scope of that conformance is. And
Andrew, just to take that a little bit further, I think I am sure if you look at the trademark guidelines, it does include that you should not be using it unless you're authorized to do so. So in a way, it's implied that if you conform, you can use the logo. The difference is that it does not require you to declare whether you have a program or whether you're conformant as an organization as a whole. So I'm not concerned about the use of the trademark because it is implied that if you're using it, you must have gone through the certification process. But it leads to ambiguity as to if I'm somebody who's just looking at a customer, I wouldn't be able to know whether they're conformant as an organization or as a program.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Just as a note, what we do is we will put the logo next to a specific product that release, right? And we make the statement that this version of this product, right, has been through an OpenChain conforming program. And I think there is no real guidance right now, I think, on how someone might quantify that, right? And that's something we should consider. Okay. Any other comments about that? Okay, let's just build on that a little bit. I think it's related to your other point here, Sammy. You were asking about how one might implement the 18-month validation point.
That's correct. Sorry, I was on mute. So that's correct. Again, I'm just thinking about we have chosen to use the online app, and I wondered whether we can. I think Gary was probably Gary's around. I don't know, Gary, whether there is the ability to use that certification date to send whoever completed the certification a reminder that your certificate is about to expire.
That is a really good idea. So the function isn't implemented currently, but we probably should track that as an enhancement issue for the app. We'll probably do an update on the app in about 6 months or so.
Right.
And hopefully we'll be able to get some of those features in.
Great, because again, doing it within the organization, I think it is much more difficult to people change roles and change companies, etc. So using internal reminders and so on is much more difficult. Whereas at least if there is somebody who's registered, and even if they change roles, that typically is diverted to somebody else within the organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, understandable that people leave, come and go for sure. Any other thoughts about this requirement and how one might implement it?
I just have one question. How was the 18 months selected? Why 18 months?
Why do we come up with 18 months? Okay.
Yeah.
It was probably a discussion we had. It could have been 12 months. It could have been 24 months. It could have been 18 months. I think there was this debate around that range. The basic premise is, programs go stale. Even though you do conformance, within some amount of time. It could be even within 12 months, things start to sometimes, people stop following the requirements of the spec, right? Or they just don't pay attention to them. So this was a number that was chosen. It would say, it's probably not too unreasonable to ask every group, anybody who's conforming, to check their conformance within the 18 months. And the idea would be, if you go back to 6.1, you're going to make a statement on a certain date, right? And that usually could be the date used to determine when that clock started. Now, the idea is if I want to stick with 2.0 and a 3.0 comes out, I can stick with 2.0, right? I just need to periodically check to see if my organization is still, conforming, we're still have the processes are being followed and so forth. And this just forces someone to make sure that's true. Even if they don't want to go to a newer version, they can stay on the earlier version and stay on it for 5 years if they want. From a business, cost effectiveness, that's usually comforting. However, what we do want, like in my situation, if I have someone coming to audit us, I'm going to check to see. That's one of the times I will definitely check to see, are we within the 18 months? And if not, I'm going to, take the action to make sure that we go around and revalidate our processes or fix something that's not quite, up to date with the spec that I already agreed to conform with.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Any questions about that?
No. But I did have one other kind of general question on the certification. So my organization is very, very large. We have 220,000 employees, probably at least 20,000 software engineers. So, I'm just trying to think about how this can get applied across the organization and make sure that it stays valid for 18 months for, a zillion different working groups and different projects.
So what you have to, I think the thing is about staying valid within 18 months, what you need to do is, when 18 months comes around, you have to go back and revalidate. It's not, there is probably some kind of natural erosion of people following things, right? It's not saying you must, it says within the last 18 months, you validated this, okay? So you have to make sure that when that 18-month deadline comes up, you go back and revalidate everything and make sure everybody's doing the right thing again. So that's how to view that. Not that maybe 9 months into it, you got to make sure 100%, naturally people typically will hold to their processes. It's just that we know that things do erode eventually.
Right.
Okay. So as far as your big organization, it's always a concern. And one thing it's often worth highlighting is you don't need the whole organization necessarily to conform. Like in some organizations, you might have an engineering department or division. You might have two divisions. One division might be conforming and another division may not be yet conforming. And that's okay, in that if you achieve division A conformance and they're releasing product, then you can put the logo next to their product, right? In making the statement that this was put through. Now with division B, they could have their own program, and sometimes, divisions do, right? They have their own way of doing things. And they haven't quite obtained it, so they can't really leverage the logo. So sometimes organizations like to do their whole organization and just assume everything that comes out, and that's fine. Or they can choose smaller groups or even an individual product line. So we allow that. So I think it's an incremental way of doing that. When you're so big, you might just start out with this smaller group, and it might be an embedded piece of software that kind of customer really appreciates the compliance more than, say, the cloud division software. And so it might be more beneficial just to make sure that that embedded piece of software that particular product line is conforming, and you have that freedom. But I think that's where the 6.1 comes in place. You want to be very specific about which program you're talking about. Okay, and let me give the last example would be sometimes organizations have a professional service organization and sometimes they have an engineering organization. The engineering organization may be conforming and following the processes as part of the development lifecycle, but the professional services group does not. And that's fine too, but just define that within the scope of 6.1. Any other comments about that? Any thoughts or clarity? Experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to jump in again. So, Mary, one of the things that we have done, we certainly not a big organization such as yours. We're only about 8,000 employees. So it's a lot easier to control things. But we have implemented, part of our process is that there is a sign-off requirement that requires people to verify that they have followed the open source management process and adhere to the policies, including the requirements to provide the open source license compliance artifacts as part of their deliverables. So we have managed to control it by when a product is released before it departs the organization. Somebody has to sign it off and has to validate that yes, it conforms to this or complies with this process. So there are ways around it, and certainly with training and changes in responsibilities, we have part of our onboarding. Any new software engineers must attend our open source training program and complete the modules, including communicating to them where to find information and who to contact if they have any questions internally within the organization.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, I want to move on to Julian's comment or point of discussion, which was around getting some more comfort around the quality of the implementation of a particular component, such as the bill of materials. Is that correct?
Yeah, maybe if for the background, as we do the audits for the third-party audit or some third-party audits, it kind of depends on if we are looking for a certain product or just the general open source management system that is OpenChain. And if you, for instance, look at many divisions or a larger development team, and there's a well-documented OpenChain implementation, which just isn't that effective in operation, I find it hard to find a quality gate in the specification itself.
I think at the moment, that is a little bit more delegated to the potential audit you might go through with your partners or your customers. We also allow a third-party auditor to come in and evaluate your program and provide guidance. So in the way I view it is, you're correct in that it doesn't really specify to what level of quality you have to ensure the bill of materials is, for example, right? But we don't want to necessarily in the spec go there. However, it is a possibility that an organization is OpenChain conforming, and again, they are audited by their customer. And I generally see that among the bigger customers and the ones that have more sophisticated supply chains, that they may sit down with you and say, okay, you're OpenChain conforming, let's go through that. And you show them what you have, and they might say, well, we're not terribly comfortable with that, with the level of which you handle the bill of materials or the way you produce it. We're gonna put a requirement that in order for us, to do business together, you gotta take it to this level, or X level, whatever level, right? So that I think is right now more or less delegated to that audit right now that you might have with someone who, what OpenChain does is it gives us a way of focusing the discussion, right? On how to, and it gives people a real sense of comfort that there's some basic things are in place, but but the level of quality of any one of those could be challenged by your customer. It's really between you and the customer. And I use the customer as a general thought.
Yeah,
but,
Mark, Andrew here again. So, yeah, I agree with that completely. And with my Orcro hat on, we're basically putting an audit manual together. And essentially what we're saying is obviously the primary requirement is that you have a procedure in place that enables you to generate the bill of materials. But then we're saying, okay, when we go into audit, we have to make sure that the procedure that's in place has a reasonable shot at providing a reasonable bill of materials. And I completely agree that the next stage is then, it may be the customer who then actually looks at the bill of materials themselves to determine whether that's appropriate or not. So we see it very much like a financial audit, in the same way that if your financial auditors come into an organization, basically they're looking to see whether your accounts present a true and fair view of your business's situation. They're not looking at every single invoice. They're not looking at every single transaction that's undertaken. What they'll do is they will take a sample of the transactions to see that the process that you've got that feeds those transactions into your accounting system makes sense. So what pops out the other end is something that has a good chance of being reliable. And that's basically the same approach that we're taking, is to say, okay, we want to have a look and see what the process is that leads to the bill of materials. And then by looking at a few sample components, we want to make sure that those components have got the right licenses attached to them, etc. What we're absolutely not doing is doing a complete code analysis and determining that every single component has got the correct license attached to it. And we're not doing anything that can prove that a particular binary is linked to a particular set of components. What we're doing is we're looking at the procedure by which you get from the components to the binary and making sure that overall at a fairly high level that procedure makes sense. And by looking at a few samples of the way that the component ends up in the final product, that also is traceable effectively. So yeah, I would concur with that completely. We're basically focusing very much on making sure that there is an appropriate procedure in place, and that procedure has a high probability of leading to a good outcome. But we're not we're certainly not verifying that the outcome itself is 100% conformant, and everything that is provided is everything that absolutely needs to be provided on a sort of component by component basis.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, after all, this is what we do as well. The problem we have is, the problem we have is these kind of audits tend to be very centric on the one customer, and as you mentioned, this is kind of where we put this to, right? This is we have the client who wants to have a trust in his supply chain, so he's looking at all his suppliers and ask for the audit and maybe the quality if they want to. The thing that we've seen is that there are sometimes multiple companies looking at the same suppliers, or at different maybe the same suppliers, and they have different requirements in, for instance, the quality of the bill of material and the quality, for instance, if there are if for instance changes were made to GPL code or something. And this actually tends to be a problem because, or not a problem per se, but you see there are different audits for OpenChain, and this is
absolutely.
actually where we see the issue. We get it to work the way it is. Don't get me wrong there, but we kind of wonder if it is possible to be OpenChain compliant and kind of skip most of the audits this way, and not have 10 different implementations of OpenChain, which kind of is the status quo these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I see that people undertaking audit activities like you and us really need to get together separately and say, okay, this is what we regard as being an industry standard for the way that audits should be conducted. And that's sort of half what I've got in mind while I'm putting the audit manual together, is that ultimately a sort of set of standards will emerge. And it's not necessarily something that needs to go into the specification itself, but it's something that will tend to emerge as audit practice develops. So I completely understand that that is very much a concern of mine as well, is that you basically want to be comparing like with like, and it's not reasonable if as a purchaser you're selecting a number of different suppliers and they all claim to be OpenChain conformance, but that actually means very different things. So there has to be a degree of consistency there. So if it turns out there's a degree of consistency in the way in which the audits are undertaken, then that's going to make it a lot easier for the purchasers to be able to select the appropriate supplier on a level playing field. So I think that's definitely something we need to work towards, and I think it's probably something that can be done outside the scope of the specification. But if there's something easy we can put in the specification to give a bit of guidance there, that may be helpful. But I'm not sure at the end of the day whether it's an appropriate place for it.
Yeah, and I'll build on that a little. I've been in that situation actually earlier in the earlier days. It was just simply, I think a lot of times these questions really center around how do you conform or you comply with the license, like the GPL, right? And it's not so much a question about OpenChain saying, "Oh, I have a bill of materials," but they may your discussions around what should be in the bill of materials. I remember, different customers wanting different formats of different information, and what we tried to do is, move them along and say, "Hey, we have SPDX, and we deliver all this information." I'm just giving you an example of SPDX, and we can't, it's too costly to have every single customer have their own way of representing licensing information, right? For example, and that we'll deliver you an SPDX and we'll put that into the contract. I think sometimes it's a struggle and it's a balance, and I think it's trying to move along your your customers to understand that these add extra burdens. And if I get a customer that's really particularly strong on having something a certain way, I then make it I try to drive it towards a professional service engagement, saying, well, you want something beyond what we typically provide in the product, and if it's more, a more complicated, say, bill of materials information, and at least in that context, I'll say, well, we'll set up a professional service engagement and you'll pay the extra fee, right? It's not always possible, especially with very big customers, and they just demand certain things. I do think it's a dance, and it's a matter of, over time trying to come up with a generic bill of materials that you think will satisfy most of your customers. And it's not trivial, I agree, but I'm not sure it's always an open chain conforming problem as much as it is an agreement on what an artifact is, a compliance artifact. Is that your observation, or?
Well, I completely agree, and this is why this was just a thought so far, because you get my point, but I get yours as well. It is hard to write within OpenChain spec what exactly is required without creating a bloated or very, very quickly aging spec.
And I do want to make a distinction here, and I think it's important. It's a complement to the spec. Learning about how different companies do implement different parts of the spec is helpful, right? The spec is supposed to stay away from implementation, but I think what you're asking for and what Sammy referred to earlier, there are a number of case studies, and maybe we should do a little bit better job with the spec team pointing to certain parts of the spec and here's certain examples of how some people implement that part of the spec. Right now, we don't do that. And I think that's very powerful. We want to keep the spec on the how and what and why. I'm sorry, the what and why, and then the how and when. Let's look at different practices, and maybe we can point people to them, but not say those are the way to do it, but one way of doing it. I think, to your point. And sharing that experiences would be very helpful, especially when we deal with bigger customers. Okay, any other comments there? Okay, at this point, let's see, we have about 10 minutes left, so I want to go into some of the feedback we're seeing on the site. We have the issues list. I know some people there are more issues than each slide. I have additional issues. I just want to bring up the ones that we're currently discussing and move systematically through those. I wanted to talk about the ones people raised during this meeting because they're here. Okay, so but now we can jump into the one request here is Hans is asking for a markdown version of the spec, and I think we can do that. I think if someone in the community wants to generate one, I think it would be a useful tool. But the one thing I want to highlight is that because we're part of the ISO, or we're trying to become part of the ISO family, they have very specific requirements on how to format the spec. And so Markdown is not going to be the official version, but it could be a tool for collaboration, right? For us to allow people to make pull requests on that. Having said that, I mean, do other people feel that that would be useful? Any comments about that?
I think it would be useful just for the collaboration process. I understand your pain in moving to Markdown with whilst maintaining a different format, but for a public standard to create pull requests with exact changes and words, I would find this very, very helpful, especially as we would have a neatly versioned and tagged repository.
Anybody feel like that would also be true?
I mean, I think there was a big debate around this because obviously, if you look across the supply chain, there are many projects out there who not necessarily conformant, and it makes it very difficult for a organization or company to ensure the compliance. In fact, I think when we were discussing these reasonable efforts, I think there was a discussion that in some cases it's almost impossible to conform, and a number of people at the time sort of felt that we should not be putting obstacles on in front of people to achieve the conformance. So I think this is where the reasonable efforts came in.
Okay, you're talking about the reasonable efforts. I was
Yeah.
I was talking about the first one, having a markdown version. Okay, I just think it's probably generally agreed upon that a markdown version it couldn't be bad, right?
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. Let's jump to your point now that you made it, so that we can carry it with that. Yeah. So I think this is something I've heard in the other meeting too. We have the Asian meeting, Asia, and the reasonable efforts was considered to be preferred because this is not a strict legal document, and compliance can be a very fuzzy process in onto itself, right? So is that your belief too, Sammy?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think when we talked about this, it's a lot of it. A lot of the compliance is interpretation of an organization's own legal team,
Right.
What one organization might see as, yes, this fulfills the conformance. Another organization might not see it that way. So again, I think the use of the reasonable efforts was more specific around, until we have much wider adoption across the supply chain, and get in particular around projects that are floating out there that we know have compliance issues, you're almost sort of putting hurdles in front of people to using those projects, and you know, that's the rationale behind the putting reasonable efforts. Sorry, when you put it up, I was just obviously
my fault.
Remembered that specifically from our previous discussions. When we set out the 2.0 and when we reviewed the 2.0.
No.
I concur with Sammy's thought processes on that, and I think the concern is that if there's an absolute, even though it's sort of potentially part of a rationale, if there's an absolute obligation on there, then some lawyer like me, for example, will come along and sort of fixate on that as being an absolute obligation. I think also I happen to think there's a bit of a problem with reasonable commercial efforts as well, because that it's got legalistic wording, and if we and I can think that there is probably a way of rewording the whole thing better so that it's more about the process rather than using legalistic terms like reasonable commercial efforts. I can't off the top of my head at the moment think exactly what would be better wording, but I think the principle, as Sammy puts it, to say that we cannot guarantee 100% compliance, and to suggest that there is going to be 100% compliance is problematic from a legal perspective. I completely concur with that.
Yeah, and actually we stated in the FAQ, we strive to increase the probability of compliance to a great degree.
Yeah, exactly.
But we're not claiming that if someone's open chain conforming that you're guaranteed compliance. In fact, it's an impossible task, given that some of the software we grab is so poorly documented with respect to licensing. We want a reasonable effort. Yeah. Any other thoughts there? Okay. Andrew, you had this question. I think you were asking, you checking in again about the bill of materials.
Yes, exactly. I mean, this sort of really follows on from the conversation that we had earlier, and that Julian was mentioning. In that, I think it would be helpful. It seems that it would be helpful to have a specific definition of bill of materials in the specification.
Now, any thoughts about that?
This is Jeff here. I strongly agree that a bill of materials should be defined. I've seen, so many weak bill of materials that hardly are 1% of it, but it's defendable because they say, for our definition, it's our bill of materials. So having, specific is terrific. I always love to see definition of terms that can be misconstrued between parties.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Maybe one point. Maybe one of the points is not just the format exactly, like if it's a list or SPDX or whatnot, but the third-party modules, or how deep the bill of material is supposed to be, because some people just take shortcuts, and the question is, where exactly does it end?
Any other thoughts about it?
I think that's a good point, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Some people list packages. Some people drill down into file levels and subcomponents and libraries. So it is quite difficult to sort of quantify what does this mean in practice.
So I think what we could do, I do think it's a little bit challenging. I've been participating, and some of you may have been, with the NTIA, then the U.S. government's, what is it, Network Telecommunication Information Agency, or National Telecommunication Information Agency. And they've been a major effort. They're herding along 30, 40, maybe even 50 companies to define a bill of materials format. And I'm interested to see what they come out with. And as I watch that discussion go, people look at it different granularities of what a bill of materials is. Maybe what we can do is have people define what a bill of materials is within their own program and include that in their documentation, so that when they're sitting down with someone, this is what we meant when we decided to do that. However, I'm not sure that's addressing the concern here, in that, is there a more appropriate universal bill of materials definition that we can come up with? And maybe we should try to explore that and see how far we get.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to try proposing a definition. We've got a number of we've got a particular definition that we use in our template policy, which might be a good starting point. So I'm happy to suggest that as one of the, I'll go back into the issue and add that just as a possible talking point.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and put that into the issues list item that you have there on the issues list, and I think that'd be a great, helpful data point. I'm sorry, there was another comment. Was that Jeff?
That was Jeff. I guess it's this question of, how do we, you get a bill of materials and there's a one-line item that says Linux. The definition of bill of materials in some ways, I think, has to have some sort of teeth, or at least some places where the two parties involved can discuss, we need, a bill of materials to this level. And I don't know if we get to define that, because it will change over time. What we concern ourselves right now is going to be different. 3 years from now, we're going to be more concerned about supply chain and tax than we are right now. So your tool is going to be part of the definition of your bill of materials 3 or 4 years from now. But right now, nobody's ready to do that. So it does need to be dynamic, but I do think there's at least a lower bar of a definition.
So I think we'll conclude here, and I think this is a great topic that may span several meetings, right? Most likely. But I think it's one of those things we can have. And I know there are other issues in the issues list we'll get to next round. But I thought a lot of great feedback. It was a very contentful meeting here. So thank you for your comments. We'll pick it up next time. Okay?
Fantastic. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.